Last episode, I went over the myths surrounding the Greek hero Oedipus. It's a well-known story, so I won't recap it, but I pointed out that the Oedipus story was part of a wider tradition of myths. These stories concern multiple generations of the Theban royal family, and how they were plagued by a series of curses that eventually brought their doom. Oedipus's father, Laius, was cursed. Oedipus himself was cursed. The family curse builds up over time. It mutates and joins with other curses to make one big mess for the family. This episode covers what happened to the next generation of cursed Thebans, Oedipus's own sons, Eteocles and Polynices, and how they were destined to destroy each other. This part of the story is much wider in scope. The family curse will not only impact Eteocles and Polynices, a whole lot of other characters and other ancient Greek city-states will be sucked into it too. It's going to lead to all-out war, and this is an important point. With Greek mythology, if you mention a war, people assume you're talking about the Trojan War. But there were other wars, and the Theban Wars were very important. The Greek poet Hesiod called the Trojan War and the Theban Wars the two most important events of the mythical age of heroes. However, a lot of people today are not familiar with the Theban Wars, because sadly a lot of the sources for them are lost to history. These stories were very popular in ancient times, though. The events I cover in this episode are at least in part referenced in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and Hesiod's Catalogue of Women. Also in the 6th century BC, we know there was a poem by Stesichorus and another poem called the Thebaid that focused entirely on the story. Both are only known today from a few surviving fragments. From the 5th century BC and onwards, we have more material to work with. There's references in the works of Bacchylides, Pindar, the historian Pherecydes, and a handful of Athenian plays. Even later, we have Diodorus, Apollodorus, and the Romans, Hyginus and Statius. What I want to do in this episode is give a detailed overview of the First Theban War, and how the curse on Eteocles and Polynices led to it. Again, I feel a lot of people aren't familiar with this story, so instead of looking at what the various sources say, I tried to bring them together to tell a fuller story with less gaps. First, let's go back to where the last episode left off. Oedipus's deep dark secrets were revealed. In the commonly known tradition, Oedipus found out he committed the two great crimes of patricide and incest. This was so bad, and he was so devastated, Oedipus plucked out his own eyes. Oftentimes, he then goes into exile, and becomes little more than a beggar, which is what happens in a handful of Athenian plays. However, in many ancient Greek sources, Oedipus does not leave Thebes. Instead, he remains in the city, and continues to rule. At some point, he is put into what you can call house arrest. His sons Polynices and Eteocles, or maybe even the Theban nobleman Creon, the brother of Jocasta, Oedipus's mother and wife, rule Thebes in his place. But while he wasn't visible anymore, or in charge of the day-to-day affairs of the city, he was still a king. This means he was still treated like an esteemed older nobleman. Somewhere here, there was an incident that involved Oedipus and his two sons. A meal or feast was held to honor Oedipus, and a sacrifice to honor the gods was conducted before anyone could eat anything. In the ancient Greek way, the sacrifice would have involved the killing of an animal, likely a cow, bull, or sheep. The animal's body parts were roasted and handed out to the feast-goers to eat. Since Oedipus was a very important person, he would have been owed a peace. This feast was hosted by Oedipus's sons Eteocles and Polynices. It was they who set the table. It was they who performed the sacrifice and handed out the meat. When Oedipus sat at the table, he looked down at the dishes, cups, and utensils that had been set out in front of him, and a great ill feeling immediately fell over him. His mood completely changed. Polynices had sat him at a magnificent silver table, which had belonged to his ancient ancestor, Cadmus, the founder of Thebes. Also, Polynices had filled a golden goblet with sweet wine and served it to his father. Oedipus saw that these items were the special family heirlooms that were prized by his own dead father, Laius. The reminder of his father reminded Oedipus of his past crimes, and he felt shame and anger. Why had his sons served him with these? He had forbidden them from ever serving him with these objects. Oedipus was angry, and he blamed his sons for slighting him, and asked the vengeance goddesses to curse his sons. They should never divide their inheritance fairly. But then things got worse. Eteocles and Polynices began handing out the roasted meat. They were supposed to give Oedipus the shoulder, but either because they forgot or because they did it on purpose, the brothers served him the thigh. When Oedipus noticed the less prime thigh on his plate, he grew even more angry. The old king turned his plate over and cast the meat onto the ground. "Woe is me," he cried. "My sons have given this to me as an insult." He prayed to Zeus and the other immortal gods, asking that his sons should descend to the underworld after killing each other. Years before, Oedipus suffered a curse, and before that his father Laius received a curse from Pelops. It's not always clear where one curse ends and the other begins. They trickle down and impact the family in a variety of different ways. One curse leads to another. Now we have another curse, and it will lead the next generations to experience violence and bloodshed once again. According to Stesichorus, the sons of Oedipus learned of their curse from the blind prophet Tiresias. Their response, says Stesichorus and Apollodorus, was that when they were old enough to rule, Eteocles and Polynices came to an agreement. Instead of fighting over who should be the king of Thebes, they would take turns. One brother would rule for a year, and then the other brother would take over for another year. In this way, they would take turns, and power would alternate back and forth. Eteocles, as the older brother, ruled first. When it became time for Polynices to ascend the throne, he ran into trouble. Eteocles had developed a taste for power, and he decided he was not going to give it up. Polynices was banished from Thebes. Imagine a sort of palace coup, with Eteocles putting his cronies and henchmen into position, and Polynices fleeing in the dead of night. He probably raided the Theban treasury before he left, or at least was invited to take a share for himself, because he left with two very special treasures: the necklace and robe that belonged to Harmonia, the wife of Thebes' first king Cadmus. Bear in mind, these two items were also supposed to be cursed, and led to the downfall of Cadmus, Harmonia, and their daughters. Exiled, Polynices needed a place to find refuge, ideally at the court of a friendly king who would listen to his troubles. He headed south to the city-state of Argos and arrived at the palace gates at night. There, while waiting at the gates, he found another Greek hero looking for refuge. This was a man named Tydeus. We briefly heard about Tydeus before in the episode on Atlanta, Meleager, and the hunt for the Caledonian boar. Tydeus was not one of the hunters who assembled at Caledon. He was actually long gone by then. Tydeus was a member of Meleager's extended family. He was the son of Oeneus, king of Caledon. So he had the same father as Meleager, but Tydeus had a different mother. Oeneus either had Tydeus with his second wife Periboea, or, disturbingly, Oeneus' own daughter, Gorgy. That version is recorded by Apollodorus, who says Zeus made Oeneus lust after his own daughter, but there's no word on why Zeus thought this was necessary. Tydeus turned out to be a troubled youth. He killed a family member, sometimes an uncle, sometimes multiple cousins, and was exiled. In a scholiast, this is a fancy word for notes ancient Greeks wrote in the margins of ancient texts to explain things, we get a bit more of an explanation. Tydeus was apparently having dinner with an uncle and some cousins when he found out the cousins were scheming against his father Oeneus. So, what did he do? He killed them. All of them. With that, Tydeus was a murderer. He left Caledon behind. Like many Greek heroes who kill family members, Tydeus was now impure. he needed to be purified of his crimes, or they would follow him around forever. The only people who could do this kind of cleansing were kings. This was probably the reason he ended up in Argos on that dark night when Polynices arrived. So, Polynices waited outside the gates of the palace in Argos. The night was dark and cold, but there was a small amount of space on the porch. Polynices hunkered down to sleep while he waited for the morning to arrive. However, not long after, Tydeus arrived, and like Polynices, he also wanted to sleep on the porch. Tydeus was a smaller man, but he had a body knotted with muscles and possessed an aggressive fighting spirit. The two heroes began arguing over the limited space, and soon came to blows. They fought, and the sounds of their shouting and their weapons clanging on shields soon woke up the entire Argive palace. Adrastus, the king of Argos, came to investigate and found the warriors locked in combat. He saw they both wore animal skins, Tydeus that of a boar, and Polynices that of a lion, and Adrastus was reminded of a prophecy he had received years before. The prophecy told the king to marry his daughters to a boar and a lion. So before the two heroes could kill each other, Adrastus ordered them to stop. Afterwards, he married his daughter, Dapole, to Tydeus, and his daughter Argaea to Polynices. Adrastus listened to their stories, heard of their issues back home, and promised to use the power of Argos to restore them to glory in their native lands. First, Adrastus would move to support his new son-in-law Polynices' claim over Thebes. He began to gather his armies, and those of his vassals and other allies. The entire army would eventually be led by 7 fearsome champions. Frustratingly, there is no absolutely consistent listing of the 7 champions. The Athenian playwright Aeschylus, in his surviving play The Seven Against Thebes, gives a good description of the champions, and has each one later lead the siege at each of Thebes' 7 fortified gates. However, other sources differ from Aeschylus, and give different lists for who was considered a champion. There seems to be a core group, but there are always a few sources that leave a few out or include extra names. In the late periods of Greek history, the writer Pausanias actually suggested that there were originally more than 7 champions, and that Aeschylus was the first person to have a specific 7 in mind. Some modern scholars are inclined to agree with Pausanias, and think Aeschylus limited himself to 7 because having one for each city gate added extra drama to his play. But for the purposes of our story, who are all these champions? Adrastus is only sometimes included, which is weird since he's responsible for gathering everyone together. Typically, Adrastus acts as an overseer or guide for these armies, while staying out of the actual fighting. The next two are obvious, Tydeus and Polynices. After their fight on Adrastus' porch, the two warriors became the best of friends. It's possible that very early in the development of these myths, Tydeus and Polynices were viewed as a hero twosome, with Tydeus being the strong brute, and Polynices the clever scoundrel. While Adrastus is not always included in lists of the champions, many of the others, besides his son-in-laws Tydeus and Polynices, are often related in some way to the king of Argos. Capaneus was the son of a man named Hipponous. His mother was sometimes Astynome, one of Adrastus' sisters. Capaneus was a large man, very strong and a skilled warrior, but he was also extremely arrogant. So arrogant, in fact, he was very dismissive of the Olympian gods. That kind of thinking is bound to get him into trouble. According to Aeschylus, he held a shield decorated with the image of an unarmored man holding a torch, with golden letters saying, "I will burn this city." Hippomedon, another champion, was either one of Adrastus' brothers, or, like Capaneus, one of his sister's sons. Another giant of a man, Aeschylus describes him as holding a shield with a picture of the monster Typhon on it. The god Ares inspired Hippomedon to go into a battle frenzy when in combat. According to Euripides, he avoided comfortable entertainment and spent all his time training to fight. Megistius was another brother of Adrastus, and listed as one of the 7 champions in only a handful of sources. However, he is mentioned in one of the oldest, Homer's Iliad. According to Homer, Megistius attended the funeral of Oedipus, which took place years before. At the funeral, the Thebans held a series of athletic games, and Megistius won all the boxing matches. The fact that he is linked to the Oedipus myth so early suggests he was not a late addition to the Theban Wars mythic cycle. Like Megistius, Eteocles is only occasionally included among the 7 champions. He is weird for a couple reasons. Many of the champions are unsavory people. Many are incredibly arrogant and bloodthirsty. But Euripides describes Eteocles as humble and honorable. In Aeschylus's play, he carries a shield showing a man with a ladder, something that you will soon hear is probably better linked to the champion Capaneus. Scholars also point out how close his name is to Polynices' brother Eteocles, and wonder if Eteocles was added to the story around the time of Aeschylus's play. Another champion who joined the army was Parthenopaeus. He was young and only just beginning to grow a beard. A fierce, arrogant, and overconfident warrior, he swore on his spear that he would be successful in sacking the city of Thebes, regardless of the will of Zeus. Fittingly, on his shield, he decorated an image of the Sphinx, which had terrorized Thebes so many years before. Unlike a few of the champions, Parthenopaeus was not from Argos. He was from the wild land of Arcadia, and we've actually encountered him on the pod already, although he was just a baby. At the end of the episode on Atalanta, Meleager, and the Caledonian Boar, I mentioned how there was a version where Meleager successfully seduced Atalanta before he died, and how she gave birth to a son. Atalanta left that baby to die on a mountainside, but he survived and grew up to be Parthenopaeus. Sometimes, though, Parthenopaeus was given other fathers, including the god Ares. In one version, though, Parthenopaeus was not actually the son of Atalanta, but was instead another brother of Adrastus. It's highly likely this was a purposeful change in the tradition later on, and was intended to get rid of Parthenopaeus' foreign origin. In fact, there may have been a wider shift that attempted to make all of the champions related to Argos in some way. The Greek writer Pausanias suggested that when Aeschylus trimmed the number of champions down to 7, he also removed other foreign warriors from other parts of Greece. Occasionally, other names for champions trickle out of the literature. While the lists differ slightly in the sources, the core group of leaders is probably Adrastus, if he's considered a specific champion, Polynices, since they're fighting to support his claim, and then Tydeus, Capaneus, and Parthenopaeus. But there is one more very important core champion. His name is Amphiaraos. Like with some of the other champions, Amphiaraos was related to Adrastus, the king of Argos, as well, but he was a distant relative. Amphiaraos was the son of Oedipus. Oedipus was a Greek hero himself, and was apparently one of the men who joined Heracles when he attacked the city of Troy. Amphiaraos' mother, according to Hyginus, was a woman named Hypermnestra, and she was the sister of 2 other women named Althea and Leda. This means that on his mother's side, Amphiaraos was the cousin of the Greek hero Meleager, who killed the Caledonian Boar, and the hero twins Castor and Polydeuces. But it was through his father, Oedipus, that Amphiaraos was related to Adrastus. Amphiaraos' great-grandfather was a man named Melampus, and his brother was Bias, who was Adrastus' grandfather. It's all very complicated. For an easy-to-understand family tree, check out the page for this episode at www.mythmadness.com. I bring this all up because even though they were somewhat related, the families of Adrastus and Amphiaraos were locked in a feud. Sometimes Amphiaraos was even responsible for killing Adrastus' father. Sometimes the feud caused a young Adrastus to leave Argos, go to a different city called Sicyon, marry the daughter of its king, who was also related to him, become king of Sicyon, and then return to rule Argos once again. Eventually, though, the feud was ended when Amphiaraus was brought directly into the family. Adrastus and his brothers had their sister Eriphyle marry Amphiaraus. But when the years passed and it came time for the armies of Argos and their allies to assemble, Amphiaraus did not want to go to war against Thebes. The reason was Amphiaraus was a seer. He had the powers of prophecy, and he knew that the gods did not approve of the war with Thebes. He tried to warn Adrastus and the others that if they marched to Thebes, they were marching to their doom. He also argued with Tydeus. Amphiaraus blamed the whole adventure on Tydeus and complained about the man's brutality. Tydeus responded by calling Amphiaraus a sniveling coward. But the Argive armies, for some reason, likely a prophecy, needed Amphiaraus to join them. So Polynices resolved to make sure that happened. The exiled prince of Thebes went to Amphiaraus' wife Eriphyle. Previously, when Polynices left Thebes, he had taken the old necklace of Harmonia with him. Now, he carried it into the home of Eriphyle and Amphiaraus. Polynices showed the necklace to Eriphyle. Her eyes reflected its glittering gold, and he gave it to her as a gift. As a bribe, really, for persuading her husband Amphiaraus to join the war. Somehow, none of the sources are clear on this, Eriphyle convinced Amphiaraus. According to the Greek mythographers Apollodorus and Diodorus, when that earlier feud between Amphiaraus and Adrastus was resolved, it was agreed that if another dispute arose between them, the decision would fall on Eriphyle. If that's the case, it was up to Eriphyle if Amphiaraus would leave or not, and she chose to send him to his death. Yet, he apparently knew that she had taken the bribe to betray him, maybe due to his prophecy powers. Before he left, Amphiaraus went to his son Alcmaeon and made him swear to avenge his father if he did not return. Once the army was ready to depart, Amphiaraus stepped into his chariot. Unlike the other 7 champions, no symbol was fixed to the front of his shield, for he did not wish to appear the bravest, but to be the bravest. He turned his head to look back at the assembled crowd, waving the warriors on. His wife, Eriphyle, stood watching, with their 2 sons next to her. Around her neck hung Harmonia's cursed golden necklace. And with that, the 7-ish champions, described by Bacchylides as having red shields and being the best of the Argives, left their armies for Thebes. With the armies on the move, Adrastus and Polynices decided to send an ambassador to Thebes to open negotiations. Sounds like a perfect job for someone with tact, someone with patience, someone with diplomatic skills. Any guesses? Surprise! They chose Tydeus. The fact Tydeus, of all people, was entrusted to speak for the entire army suggests he was not always the savage and brutal warrior he was made out to be in some of the surviving source material. Additionally, unlike any of the other champions, Tydeus was held in high esteem by the Olympian gods. Specifically, he had the very special attention of the goddess Athena. This isn't the first time he's played ambassador either. Earlier, when Adrastus was gathering the armies, Tydeus and Polynices traveled together to the neighboring kingdom of Mycenae to seek that city's powerful support for the war. At first, the Mycenaeans were going to help, but when they consulted their oracles, they learned that Zeus was opposed to their involvement. Tydeus and Polynices returned to Thebes. Their first entry into the world of diplomacy didn't work out as they hoped. This time, Tydeus set out for Thebes alone. He was expected to deliver an appeal for negotiation, or a call for Polynices to return to Thebes. It was supposed to be a gentle message, backed up by the knowledge that the largest army Greece had ever seen had assembled to support Polynices. Tydeus arrived in Thebes and found Polynices' brother Eteocles and the other Theban noblemen holding a large feast. They were in no mood to listen to his downer of a message, although the Roman poet Statius's version of this story has Tydeus and Eteocles in a long conversation, with the king ultimately refusing to negotiate with his brother. With Tydeus's message now delivered, and his gentle words ignored, it was now time for the real Tydeus. The champion challenged all of the feasting noblemen to a series of one-on-one duels. With Athena's divine help, he won them all. With the nobles defeated and embarrassed, Tydeus probably promised them more where that came from, and then left to return to the Argive army. The losing Theban nobles were so annoyed, they sent a group of 50 men to overtake Tydeus on his way back and ambush him in the woods. Their attack failed spectacularly. Tydeus killed 49 of the men. Athena intervened and advised him to spare the 50th man, one of the leaders of the group, and to send him back to Thebes to strike fear in the heart of Eteocles. There is one more incident at Thebes involving Tydeus. It's not clear where exactly this goes in the story, but it obviously occurred in Thebes or very nearby. It may have happened long before the war, during Tydeus's time as ambassador, or even during the final battle. Somehow, Tydeus found himself in the vicinity of a woman named Ismene. This Ismene is the sister of Polynices and Eteocles. Ismene likely never left Thebes, so how Tydeus got near her is anyone's guess. Ismene was having an affair with a man named Theoclymenus. This affair greatly offended the goddess Athena. The goddess ordered her favorite warrior to kill the woman, so he ran into the woman's bedroom, caught her with her lover, and stabbed her in the chest. Ismene's lover escaped. References to this event come from the poet Mimnermus around 630 BC, so it's one of the older available sources to these Theban myths. Anyway, with Tydeus's return from delivering messages and kicking butt, the army of Argos continues its march toward Thebes, kicking up dust as it went. When they finally arrived, the 7 great commanders slaughtered a bull over a black shield, and then touching the bull's guts with their hands, they swore an oath to Ares and to Enyo, that either they would level the city and sack it by force, or after dying would smear the soil with their blood. In Thebes itself, the nobles have grown out of their previous nonchalance toward the approaching army and have begun to panic. Eteocles consults the seer Tiresias about their chances, and Tiresias advises him that plenty of blood will be spilled, but Thebes will still stand in the end. With that, Eteocles climbs the walls and looks out over the parapets to watch the encamped army below. In Aeschylus's play The Seven Against Thebes, lookouts point to Eteocles the various enemy leaders, as each of the champions moves to attack one of Thebes' 7 gates. Eteocles assigns his own champions to move into position to defend the city. Like with the 7 champions fighting against Thebes, the 7 champions fighting for Thebes vary slightly across the different literary sources. One of them was obviously Eteocles himself. A number of the rest are really just names, with little backstory. One was Megarius, who was a son of the Theban nobleman Creon. Another champion was named Periclymenus. He was a son of Poseidon, and his mother was the seer Tiresias' daughter. A final important one was Melanippus. He was from one of the original noble families of Thebes that sprang from the ground in the time of Cadmus. Eteocles sent Melanippus to defend the city gate being attacked by Tydeus. In some accounts, the siege first started with a pitched battle. The invading Argive force won this battle, and the Theban army retreated to safety behind the city's walls. The Argive champion Capaneus stood below. Capaneus had a ladder, and he placed it against the walls so he could scale them and climb up top to fight the defenders of Thebes. As he made his way up the ladder, he shouted that he would take the city and burn it to the ground. Even Zeus would not be able to stop him. But Capaneus had offended the gods for the last time. From the heavens above, Zeus threw down a bolt of lightning and turned Capaneus into a charred corpse. And so Capaneus was our first champion against Thebes to meet his end. Meanwhile, At another Theban gate, the champion Parthenopaeus directed the warriors under his command in the attack. He made his advance with a savage heart and a terrifying look. In Euripides' play, The Seven Against Thebes, he came up against the defender Actor. But in a different Euripides play, the Theban hero Periclymenus was at the same gate. Periclymenus killed Parthenopaeus by dropping rocks on his head. On another side of the city, the invaders either broke down one of the city's gates, or a force of defenders came out to fight them. Either way, Tydeus and Megistius fought their enemies on the ground level. Out of the gate came the Theban hero Melanippus. In a series of duels, Melanippus killed Megistius and then stabbed Tydeus in the gut. Tydeus fell and began to bleed out, but before Melanippus could deliver the killing blow, Tydeus's comrades rushed forward and pulled the wounded hero away. At the same time, the champion Amphiaraus, who was fighting at the same gate, came forward and began his own duel with the brave Melanippus. Now out of the fighting, Tydeus lay dying. Fortunately for him, the protection of Athena was about to pay off. The goddess arrived, bearing immortality in the form of a drink or potion, and was ready to allow her favored hero to join the rest of the deathless gods. But just as she arrived, Amphiaraus decapitated Melanippus. Tydeus saw his potential killer fall, and called out to Amphiaraus to throw him the head of his enemy. Amphiaraus, a seer, knew what was going to happen, but threw the head anyway. When Tydeus caught the head, he broke open the skull and started eating Melanippus's brain. Athena was disgusted. Only the most savage barbarians committed such acts of cannibalism. Athena could no longer bring herself to make Tydeus an immortal. As she turned away, leaving Tydeus to die, the bleeding hero begged her to make his son an immortal in his place. And with that, Tydeus, and yet another Argive champion, died. But what is actually going on here? Why did Tydeus even resort to eating the brain? It's important to remember that the literary sources for the Theban War go back to the days of archaic Greece. And like many episodes from Greek myth, they were supposed to take place even earlier, in the centuries before the Greek Dark Ages, when the Mycenaean civilization existed. While that time was viewed by the Greeks as a legendary age of heroes, a glorious time full of glorious people, in the real world it was also a time of rampant social inequality, violence, and antiquated superstition. In the Theban myths, Tydeus's brutal behavior shows the crudeness that even in the time of Homer was already thought to be primitive and undesirable. What's more, we actually get similar hints in other epic poems from the archaic period. In Homer's Iliad, there are actually 3 examples of people saying they will eat another human's raw flesh, although they are never actually shown to do this. But what's the point of eating it anyway? Well, there are examples of groups from across the globe that did historically perform cannibalism. In these, when defeated enemies are eaten, there are typically 2 reasons why. It's either one last way of showing dominance over or contempt for an enemy, or it's done in a more ritualistic way, where the defeated enemy is acknowledged to have some kind of special quality, their good fighting skills, for example, or their cleverness, or their bravery, and the victor hopes that eating their flesh will give them some of those special qualities. With Tydeus, we could go maybe either way, but doing it as a final act of dominance over Melanippus, who had already stabbed him, is probably more consistent with Tydeus's character so far in the story. After providing Melanippus's head to the dying Tydeus, Amphiaraus climbed into his 4-horse chariot and went back to the fighting. Eventually, space between the armies opened, and Amphiaraus came face to face with the Theban hero Periclymenus. He had left the safety of Thebes' walls, and was also fighting from the back of a chariot. Amphiaraus fled from the Theban hero, while Periclymenus pursued him. It's not a very heroic action on the part of Amphiaraus, but the poet Pindar says that amid divinely sent panic, even the children of gods flee, so maybe Amphiaraus was forced to do it by the watching Olympians. Periclymenus began to catch up, and just before he could drive his spear into Amphiaraus's back, Zeus intervened to save the champion from disgrace. He threw a lightning bolt at the ground, causing a great hole to open up. Amphiaraus fell in, chariot, horses, and all, and was consumed by the earth. While it might seem like a punishment, Zeus's action was intended to save Amphiaraus. In fact, falling into the earth didn't even kill him. As a seer, he would later continue to give out prophecies from his new home down below. Finally, it is time for Oedipus's curse to be fulfilled. Polynices and the Argives under his command stormed the seventh gate of Thebes. Defending the gate was King Eteocles. According to Aeschylus, Eteocles knew of Oedipus's curse, but believed it was circumvented, since Polynices had been sent away from Thebes and apparently paid off with the treasures of Harmonia. But as the battle continued, he looked down from the walls and saw it would be his brother who would face him. It was that moment Eteocles knew his doom had come. He abandoned himself to the will of the gods, hoisted his spear, and prepared for battle. When the two brothers approached each other on the field, Polynices challenged Eteocles to single combat. Eteocles accepted. They rushed at each other with swords drawn. They both fought with an intense ferocity, finally ending when both mortally wounded each other. As the brothers died, the earth's dust swallowed the black streams of their blood. In versions where their mother Jocasta is still alive, she rushes out of Thebes and kills herself overtop her two sons' dead bodies. Adrastus, the king of Argos, watched the two brothers kill each other. With the death of Polynices, the war lost its purpose. It wasn't supposed to go this way. Adrastus had built the largest army Greece had ever seen. They had won the first battle and pushed the Thebans to seek shelter behind the city's walls. Things had grown steadily worse since then. The 7 gates of Thebes never fell, and each of the 7 champions met their deaths one by one. Defeated, and wearing dirty and torn clothes, Adrastus left the battlefield on his horse Arion. Behind Adrastus, the bodies of the fallen lay scattered across the ground. 7 great pyres burned, for the 7 great armies and their 7 dead champions. Their corpses fed the flames, and white smoke rose into the skies above. The war of the 7 against Thebes had failed. And that's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. As always, thank you for listening.